Hi, students. You have been chosen to represent the women's suffrage movement during the Progressive Era. And so in this video, I'm going to give you some background information about your topic on women's suffrage, so an overview, and then I'll also provide some suggestions for your Donate to My Progressive Cause project. So right off the bat, we need to know that suffrage means the right to vote. We talked about that a little bit in class on Thursday when we were looking at the Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism speech. But the right to vote is the same thing as suffrage, which is the same thing as enfranchisement. Disenfranchisement is getting the right to vote taken away. Okay, so suffrage and enfranchisement are the right to vote. All right, so first, your goal. Your group wants to get your Progressive Era classmates to donate their money to the cause of passing a federal constitutional amendment guaranteeing women's right to vote across America, no matter where they live, no matter what state they're in. So first, you might want to establish some threats to women's suffrage. Why are women not getting the right to vote? Okay, there's a various number of hurdles in the way. So one of those hurdles is kind of demonstrated by the picture on the left. A woman is standing next to a banner that says Kaiser Wilson. Now, she's referring to President Woodrow Wilson, who was one of the Progressive Era presidents, but she's referring to him as Kaiser, which is what they would call like the German head of state. And her banner reads, "Have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed?" Well, we just finished fighting World War I, and Woodrow Wilson wanted to, help the German people out. And this woman is pointing out 20 million American women are not self-governed. So she's pointing out this contradiction in American politics where we will go fight wars on the behalf of the self-government of other people, like Germans in this case, but we won't allow women to self-govern themselves with the right to vote in America. Now, the image on the right is a totally different threat to suffrage. It's not political, it's more of a mindset of misogyny that's rampant during this time as well. So the cartoon on the right shows a woman going off to vote, and the man is at home with the children. So obviously this is a misogynistic appeal to a family. If women are empowered, men are disempowered. Now we know that's not the case, but we're pretending that we are making our plea to our classmates during the Progressive Era. So we would have to kind of address what that mindset would be at the time of misogyny. There's also anti-suffragists who are women as well, women who don't want women to vote, okay? So in general, anybody who was against women's suffrage was called an anti-suffragist, but many of these antis, as they were abbreviated, were women themselves. Oh, really quickly, this cartoon, the caption has the anti-suffragette women saying, "Oh, save us, senators, from ourselves." So they're against women's right to vote. They think the women who are asking for the right to vote are wrong. They're stepping outside of their place. So anti-suffragists in general believed that women were high-strung, irrational, and emotional, and this meant that they weren't suited for the political sphere. They thought women were not smart or educated enough, although during this time we start to see the rise of women's colleges and more women attaining higher education in general. They thought that women should stay at home. Women were too physically frail. They would just get tired walking to the polling station. It would be cumbersome for them to physically go vote. And they thought women would become masculine if they voted. So again, we have to kind of, for the purposes of this project, place ourselves in the context of this time. That is not something that we would think today, but our time period isn't going past 1919. So we're taking this as an argument that we need to go against in our project. All right, so you need to include a data source in your project when you're appealing to your fellow classmates to donate their money to your cause. And so you could potentially use this map of women's suffrage before 1919. So this map shows which states allowed equal suffrage along with the date that they allowed it. We notice these are mostly states in the western half of the United States. They tended to be a little bit more liberal, less conservative. And then there's areas with partial women's suffrage in that kind of light orange color, and in the beige yellow color, states with no women's suffrage. So that's why your goal is a federal constitutional amendment, because you believe and you're trying to get your classmates to donate their money to the cause so that every woman in every state, regardless of where she lives, is enfranchised. Okay, so who is already part of the movement? Okay, so earlier in the women's suffrage movement, this is a movement that's been going on far before the progressive era ever began. And in the 1800s, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were two big pillars of the women's suffrage movement. They started advocating for the cause in like the mid 1800s. During the progressive era, they pass away. And so a new generation of women inherit the movement and continue working towards suffrage. So in the early 1900s, we start to see many young middle-class women who go to college and join the suffrage movement as they become more educated. We also see many working-class women who might not have gone to college, but they're joining because they're hoping that with the vote, they can help improve their working conditions. So these might be appeals that you can make to your progressive era classmates as you're trying to, convince them that their money will help your cause. Now, the women's suffrage movement is incredibly complicated because there are a lot of different factions that want different results and think about going about the results in different ways. So the first organization that we're going to talk about is the most conservative. And when you're appealing to your classmates, you need to tell them where their money is going to go to. So you have to pick an organization that you can say, hey, listen, if you donate to my cause, your money is going to go to this organization to help get women's suffrage passed. So the first potential organization you can tell them their money is going to is the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And this was led by Carrie Chapman Catt. She believed that we needed a careful state-by-state strategy. So we should go to those, orange states and then the yellow states in order to get the momentum needed to eventually get a federal constitutional amendment passed. She supported President Wilson, even though, like we said at the beginning at that slide, President Wilson was not really a friend of the suffrage movement. He wasn't doing a lot to get the suffrage movement going. But Carrie Chapman Catt reasoned that because he was a Democrat, he was maybe more amenable to suffrage overall than Republicans would be. She also believed in acting ladylike so as not to embarrass the movement. Remember that a big argument against suffrage was that women would become more masculine, and this was a big fear for many men in America. Not all, but many. And so she was kind of trying to negate that by being overly ladylike and presenting herself in a very conventional manner to try and neutralize that argument that, oh, if women vote, they're going to become too masculine. So it was a legitimate tactic, but it was playing kind of into the stereotypes of the time, which is why she's considered one of the more conservative parts of the movement. One of the more radical parts of the movement that was actually militaristic at times in their tactics was the National Women's Party. They actually split off from the former group on the previous slide because their tactics differed so much. They were led by Alice Paul, and they believed in much more aggressive strategies. First, they wanted a constitutional amendment. They didn't want to go state to state and try and build momentum. They thought that this was so important it needed to come from like a federal decision from the top down. They adopted very unladylike strategies, that's putting it kind of nicely, and they borrowed a lot of them from British suffragettes. So they would heckle politicians, which means they would kind of get up in their face and, kind of be a little bit antagonistic, but really they just wanted to talk about their cause. They picketed in front of the White House. Um, Lots of more aggressive strategies at the bottom. They were put in jail because of the picketing, where they would go on a hunger strike when they were at jail to keep their protests with like momentum. On the picture on the slide shows Lucy Burns. She was part of the National Women's Party as well, along with Alice Paul. And Lucy Burns was jailed for more days than any other woman associated with the suffrage movement. She had earned multiple jail sentences because of her protests, and she's pictured here in a workhouse. Sometimes they would send the suffragettes if they had a lot of like jail time. They would send them to a workhouse, and she's pictured there during one of her arrests. They refused to support President Wilson because he was not an advocate of women's suffrage. So we can see how the National Women's Party is much more aggressive, much more militaristic, and the National Association for Women's Suffrage on the previous slide is much more conservative, trying to appeal to everyday people, whereas Alice Paul's movement is much more radical. There's also a third option, and that is the National Association of Colored Women. Mary Church Terrell, and we talked about her father, Robert Reed Church, in our Reconstruction unit. She actually is elected the first president of the National Association of Colored Women. And Ida B. Wells, who we also talked about in our Reconstruction unit, is one of the members of the National Association of Colored Women as well. Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells felt like they needed to form a separate organization because there was a lot of racism in the other organizations that we talked about. Suffrage organizations often excluded or overlooked the contributions of African American women. So just because all of them were women and they all wanted the right to vote doesn't mean that issues of racism just flew out the window. So for example, when the suffragists would have parades, they would tell the Black women members that they needed to march separately from them. So for example, in one parade, Ida B. Wells was not allowed to march. She ended up walking off the sidewalk and joining the march anyways, because she wasn't going to stand on the sidelines. We know that's not who she was or in her character. But there was a lot of racism within these organizations. And so Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, and others formed the National Association of Colored Women as a place where they could work together. But they're concerned with suffrage, but that's not the only thing they're working on. They also have other civil rights concerns. They wanted to eradicate Jim Crow laws in the South, and they wanted to fight against effort to disenfranchise African American men with the poll taxes, literacy taxes, grandfather clauses, all of those things that we've discussed that were disenfranchising Black men. The banner that we see on the screen is the National Association of Colored Women's motto, which was "Lifting as we climb." All right, so overall, your group's goal is to give women the vote with a constitutional amendment. So you have a lot of information on the threats that women's suffrage was facing and the different organizations that were working to try and bring suffrage to every woman in America. So I'm really excited about your group's topic, and I can't wait to see your presentation.